this exciting action-packed video, and okay, I know it's not really action-packed, but if you're a camera nerd, this is pretty exciting because we have sales data coming out of Japan from Yodo showing their top 10 cameras sold, and we're going to be able to compare that sales data to the top 10 cameras sold in the United States at a very big retailer called B&H. The one question I have is the Canon EOS R6 Mark II still the number one, the king, or has it been dethroned by the Panasonic S5 Mark II? Details coming up, but first, please do me a favor. Follow me on Twitter, subscribe to this channel, choose all notifications, like, comment, and all that good stuff. I really do appreciate it. It means a lot to me, and it really helps this channel grow. Yodo is one of the top 5 Japanese retailers of mirrorless cameras. They're absolutely massive. Their stores are huge, but what I like about them most is that they release their sales data every 2 weeks without exception. But how does the sales data at Yodo compare to B&H's top 10 that we got last week? Let's get into it. If you're a regular subscriber of this channel, you know that these videos really aren't all that exciting unless, of course, you're a big camera nerd. I just love the information. I like to see how things change from week to week. And Yodo releases their sales data every 2 weeks. But last week, B&H, a major retailer, a camera, photo, video retailer out of the United States, well, they released their sales data, and they're a pretty big store. So I thought, hey, why not? Let's compare these two this week. So we'll look at Yodo top 10, and we'll compare those to B&H's top 10, and we can see if there's any differences between the two regions. So let's take a look at 10th place. We can see that the Canon EOS R7, an APS-C camera that was announced back in May of 2022, has returned to the Yodo top 10. Since Canon started shipping the R7 back many months ago, well, it's been hard to find. Now, for the first couple of months that it was on sale, it was showing up in the top 10 at B&H. It was a fast-moving camera. We saw it body alone, and we saw it with a kit lens, along with the R10, and of course, its kit lens. And boy, it just seemed to move. And then all of a sudden, the brakes stopped. There were no Canon R7s. It was hard to find in Japan. It was hard to find at Yodo. And then, of course, we got this, apology from Canon saying, look, we're really sorry. Demand is much higher than we expected. We're going to do our best to get you your camera as soon as possible. And of course, we saw that the Canon EOS R8 also showed up on this list with a bunch of lenses. And of course, the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. So it's good to see that the Canon EOS R7 is back in stock. And over at B&H, well, we have a completely different camera. This one really surprised me. Can you guess which camera is going to be in the top 10 at B&H? And if you already watched my video from last week, don't say anything. It's not a Canon. It's not a Sony. It's not a Pentax. It's not an Nikon. It's not even the Alice camera. It's not a Panasonic. It's a Kodak. That's right. It's a Kodak. Which one is it again? The Pix Pro FX55. A Kodak camera in 10th place. I would be really surprised if the camera showed up in first place, but yeah, I was really surprised to see that camera, a compact camera, a very cheap camera by Kodak, in 10th place. In 9th place, we have the Canon EOS R10 with the 18 to 150mm image stabilized STM. And as I just said, the Canon EOS R7 and the R10 have pretty much been shut out at Yodo over the past couple of months. But I think Canon's starting to get more of those units shipped, and we're starting to see Canon showing back up again in the Yodo top 10. But yeah, for a good couple of months, we just weren't seeing any cameras coming out of Yodo in Japan, and people started wondering, has Canon completely collapsed? Has their sales data just completely evaporated off the map? Is this all related to that third-party lens enforcement? And, you know, there was some inclination that that could be part of it, but no, Canon was just having trouble getting enough parts, getting enough cameras out the door, and it looks like they're back on track. And over at B&H, we have another compact camera, also a Canon, and that's the PowerShot SX740. Taking a look at 8th place, we have the Sony A7 IV in kit form. The Sony A7 IV, since it started shipping in December of 2021, well, it's been at the top of the charts no matter where you go, whether it's the United States, whether it's Japan, whether it's Europe. People love the Sony A7 IV. It's got a good set of capabilities. It's $500 more over its predecessor, and it's the same price as the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, but also the Mark I as well. But what do we have at B&H? Well, we have the Fuji X100V, and this has to be one of the most beautiful, stylish, compact cameras, but it's not cheap. It's not like the Kodak Pix Pro FX55. This is a high-quality camera. It's built small. It's built, designed for travel, to go into your pocket, to go into your purse. to not get in the way. But finally, in 7th place, we finally get to see a Nikon, the Nikon Z50. This is the SKU with 2 zoom lenses, so you see what Yodo does if they have multiple SKUs. So let's say they have the Z50, then they have the Z50 with a lens and a Z50 with another lens, and they're complete packages. Well, they have different SKUs and they report them as separate products. B&H, well, they don't do that. So if you've got multiple SKUs and they're all for the Sony a7 IV, well, then B&H says, well, they're all the a7 IV. I kind of like that way of doing it because it gives more, you get to see more cameras in the top 10. Sometimes over at Yodo, we saw the Sony a7 IV plus the kit SKU. We saw the Canon EOS R10 and the kit, and the R7 and the kit. So essentially, we got 6 SKUs, but only 3 different camera models. So I like how B&H does it better. And speaking of B&H, we also have a Nikon, but this is the Nikon Z9, the most impressive camera that Nikon's ever developed for the Z mount, their flagship mirrorless camera that when it was announced back in October of 2021, it took everybody by storm. This camera could do 8K at 60 frames per second. It did Apple ProRes in 4K, and it could shoot up to 120 frames per second at 11 megapixels, or it could shoot 20 frames per second lossless RAW at 45 megapixels, generating some astonishing data rates of 1.2 gigabytes per second. It's an impressive camera. I love this camera. I wouldn't mind having this camera, but I don't have an inventory of Z lenses or even F lenses to, well, soften the blow a little bit. But Nikon knocked $1,000 off it compared to its previous DSLR at $5,500, and that's $1,000 less than the Sony Alpha 1. Actually, it's $1,400 less than the Sony Alpha 1 if you take into account the battery grip, which comes extra. And of course, the Canon, well, the R3, that's $6,000, and the 1DX Mark III, the real flagship camera, despite what Canon tells you, well, actually, we have to go with what Canon tells us. So the R3 is their current flagship camera, but their previous DSLR, their flagship camera, sells for $64.99. So yeah, the Nikon came in at a really good price point with really good capabilities, and I'm pretty impressed with that camera, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the Nikon Z8. In 6th place, we have our only cinema camera, the Sony FX3. But I'm a little bit surprised that we don't see the FX30, not in B&H, not in Yodo. At $1,798 with the same capabilities as the FX3 and of course the Sony a7S III, I think this has to be one of the best values out there, but apparently folks in Japan, in Tokyo, don't think the same, and folks over in the United States, well, they obviously don't think the same either because we don't see the FX3 and we don't see the FX30 in this top 10. But keep in mind a little bit of a caveat here. These top 10s are based on what cameras are available for sale. If the FX3 and the FX30 are selling out really, really well and they sold out at the end of, well, 2022 and there aren't many around right now, well, that would be a good reason as to why we don't see them in the B&H top 10 and why we don't see the FX30 in the top 10 as well. But over at B&H in 6th place, we have the Sony a7R5, a camera that was announced in late October of 2022. I love how bold this camera is, and yes, while compared to the Canon EOS R5, the video specs aren't as impressive, but other capabilities such as its pixel shift technology, where even if you have a car moving through the scene, or you have people or animals or multiple thereof, it does a great job. You just don't see any artifacts compared to other manufacturers. And of course, it has its own dedicated artificial intelligence deep learning chip, its own AI chip. Now, while we see deep learning in other camera manufacturers such as Canon in the 1DX Mark III, the R6, the R6 Mark II, the R5, and the R3, it's part of their autofocus system, but it's not in hardware. It's not they don't have a dedicated chip. It's all done in firmware. To have a dedicated chip says they're pretty serious about this. And it's not just being applied to autofocus, it's being applied to image processing as well. And maybe that's why that the pixel shift technology on the Sony a7R5 is so much better. And in 5th place, we have a pair of R5s. At Yodo, we have the Sony a7R5, and at B&H, we have the Canon EOS R5. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Simon, did you make a mistake? You've already mentioned the Sony a7R5. But if you'll recall, that wasn't in 5th place. That was in 6th place at B&H. We're talking about the Sony a7R5. It's moved up a spot in Japan in 5th place. And of course, we have the Canon EOS R5 also in 5th place. And I think it's I think it's interesting that we see both of these cameras in 5th place. The R5 in 5th place and the Sony a7R5 in 5th place. Not only are these two cameras placing in the same position in different parts of the world, east versus west, but these two cameras are also in the same segment. They're very closely priced to each other as well, and they both offer very impressive specifications. Like I said earlier, the Canon EOS R5 with 8K video, 8K RAW at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, well, it does beat out the Sony a7R5, which can only do 24 and 25 frames per second. It can't do RAW, and it does it with a 1.2 times crop. And if you're thinking, well, yeah, you're beating up on the Sony a7R5, no, I'm just saying that the Canon R5 has better video specs when it comes to stills. Well, this is where the Sony shines. Again, that pixel shift technology that I talked about, using that dedicated AI chip really helps in removing artifacts. But in the stills capabilities, 61 megapixels versus 45 megapixels, and of course you get 10 frames per second, but you're shooting with a higher, well, resolution versus the R5. You get 20 frames per second, but it's 45 megapixels. So both of these cameras, they're not identical. It's not like one is better than the other, but depending on your scenario, one camera might be better for you, but both are still pretty impressive cameras. The Nikon Z9 showed up in 7th place over at B&H, but in Japan, well, the Japanese like this camera a little bit more than we do in the West, placing it in 4th spot, while folks in the United States have a greater appreciation for the Canon EOS R7. It ranks in 4th place versus, what was it, 9th or 10th place in the 9th or 10th place. Where is it here? No, it was in 10th place. So the Japanese, well, they have the R7 all the way down in 10th place, and of course it's 4th place here in North America. And because I talked about it, well, at length when we covered it in 10th place, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. So let's hurry up and get up to the top 3. And in 3rd place, we have the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. But another camera that was recently announced around the same time as the R6 Mark II is in 3rd place over at B&H. Do you remember which camera that is? Can you recall? It's a Fuji. Take a guess at which one. No, it's not the XH2 or the XH2S. It's the XT5. So in 3rd place, we have the XT5 here in North America or the United States. And in Japan, we have the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. But in 2nd place, we have the same camera. And when I mean the same camera, it's the same camera in Japan as it is in the United States. Can you guess which camera this is? It really shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise that this camera is the Sony a7 IV. Like I said earlier on in this video, this camera has been selling out very, very well since it started shipping in December of 2021. It's just been topping the charts. It doesn't matter whether you're in Europe, Africa, North America, Japan, or even in Antarctica. This camera's just, well, it's moving off the shelves. It's selling very, very well. Nothing seems to be stopping this camera, not even supply shortages. But I know what you really want to know. Who's the king? Which camera tops the charts at B&H in the United States and Yodobashi in Japan? Well, let's go ahead and cover B&H because we already did a video last week. And in the #1 spot at B&H, we have the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, and that places about 4 Canon cameras in the top 10. So which camera do you think will be in the #1 spot at Yodobashi? Now, I did tease a little bit at the beginning, and I did mention the Panasonic S5 Mark II, but that doesn't mean that this camera is actually in 1st place. Can you guess which camera shows up in 1st place at Yodobashi here in 2023 in March? Well, it's actually from their February sales data. Take a wild guess. No, it's not a Canon, it's not a Sony. It's the Panasonic S5 Mark II. We have a new king. Well, we have a king in the United States, and that's the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, but we have a new king in Japan, the Panasonic S5 Mark II. For anybody who is doubting this camera and its capabilities in terms of its autofocus and its video capabilities, well, the Japanese didn't doubt that. They see the value in this camera, placing it in the #1 spot. I'm also very impressed with this camera. I've always liked Panasonic. I liked how their cameras were oriented towards video shooters, and long before Canon started providing regular firmware updates that not only solved bugs but also provided feature enhancements, big ones, such as, well, Canon Log 3, a better autofocus system, tracking planes, trains, and automobiles, and of course getting that unlimited recording at 8K 30 frames per second RAW, or 4K HQ, which is 8K over sample 4K. And if you're impressed with the number of firmware updates that Canon has been releasing for the R5, well, take a look at Lumix because they were doing it long before Canon, and they were releasing enhancements and bug fixes, and I love that about Lumix. They were doing it before anybody else, and I'm happy to see Canon doing it, and I like to see Nikon do it a bit more, and I'd love to see Sony at least even try to do it. But Lumix with their cameras, there's something strange happened. When they released a phase detect autofocus system, I knew I'd look at and see their cameras a little differently. But now when I look at the S5 Mark II, I see it as a much more capable camera. And it's not because of its sensor size or its resolution, or that it has a phase detect autofocus system. It's now that I can choose to use a manual focus system or an autofocus system depending on what my needs are and not the limitations of the camera. And when I see the tools that the camera has to offer in terms of video shooters, it's just very impressive what Panasonic does. So I'm really happy to see this camera in the #1 spot, and I think it's well deserved. My only question is, when are we getting the announcement for the Panasonic S1, the S1 Mark II, the refresh of the S1, or what about the S1R Mark II? But most importantly, the video-centric of them all is the S1H Mark II. I'm really looking forward to seeing what these cameras are capable of, and I really do think that the competition, I'm not exactly sure where Panasonic's going to aim. I think they need to aim at the R5, the Sony a7 R5, and whatever the Z8 does. But, well, based on the price of the Mark Is, they could aim anywhere from, well, around the Sony a7S III or even the R6 for the a7 IV. I'm not really sure what they're going to do. But according to others, I think it would be foolish, and I agree, that they don't put at least 8K video in the successor to the S1H. But let's take a look at the numbers once again. Which cameras did the best? Well, over at B&H, we see that Canon had 4 cameras in the top 10, and one of those being a compact camera with only 2 Sonys, 1 Nikon, 2 Fujis, and yeah, a Kodak. Is it just me? Am I the only one who finds that strange that we've got a Kodak in the top 10? Let me know in the comment section down below. But over at Yodo, we see, well, we don't see as diverse amount of different brands in the top 10. We see 3 Canons and 4 Sonys, although 2 of those are the same make. It's the a7 IV and the a7 IV with the kit. So basically we're getting 3 separate Sony cameras, 3 Canon cameras, 2 Nikons, and a single Panasonic. But that Panasonic is all the way up in first place. So really interesting numbers. And also let me know what you think of these numbers. Do you really enjoy these regular updates where we take a look at sales data from Japan? I've just started getting sales data from B&H, so I hope that we can continue to get sales data from B&H. And I'm also looking to source sales data from Europe. So if you're in Europe, if you work for a major camera retailer and you're willing to make your sales data available, let's say the top 10 cameras, let me know in, well, not the comment section, but if you go to my About page, I have an email and we can get in touch. And if you want to stay up to date on the latest news and rumors, well, then go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications. But also, please share. Share on Twitter, share on Facebook, because every time you share, every time you tweet about this channel, about these videos, well, it really feeds that YouTube formula and helps this channel grow, as does staying all the way to the end and watching this video, engaging by commenting and liking, subscribing. It really does help the channel grow. And as I said at the beginning, I very much do appreciate it. And for all those minor news and rumor items that really aren't big enough to have their own separate video, well, for those, follow me on Twitter. I publish everything there, all the minor news and rumors. Sometimes we put out 4 or even 5 stories a day. But that's it for now. Have yourself a great week, and we'll see you again soon.